So there tends to be preferences for particular interventions, and there's also a lack of research active senior surgeons. So to tackle this, there's been a number of initiatives within the UK and more recently wider to try and address this issue. And currently there are 34 surgical trainee research collaboratives established across the UK, and many of those have been established within the last 5 years. So it's a rapidly growing approach to actually conducting trials through collaboratives. And these collaboratives allow surgical trainees to join large research groups, which tend to be either focused geographically or by clinical speciality. So the networks can potentially generate new trials, they can improve recruitment to the ongoing trials, and also contribute to developing a research active consultant workforce. So these these TRCs have actually completed several surgical trials, some quite large trials, including the Rossini trial, which was led by the West Midlands Collaborative, and that was actually conducted in 21 UK centres, and also the Dreams trial, which they also led on, and also more recently the Heart trial, which has been facilitated through the Welsh Barbers Trainee Collaborative. So there's all this work going on. TRCs are increasing, the trials they're completing are increasing. But at the moment, the reasons for their successes have not been empirically evaluated, and what the facilitators and barriers may be are largely unknown. And understanding these is really key to enhancing clinician engagement in surgical trials, and also may translate into other specialities. So in response to that, the HTMR network funded the study that we've been conducting of research on surgical engagement in trials, so the Resurgence study. So you can see there on the screen, we had 3 key aims, which ultimately to identify the key reasons for successful trial conduct within the collaboratives, and to synthesize these findings into strategies that could be used to enhance the engagement and the conduct, and also to inform the medical curriculum for future clinicians. So, oh, I can hear somebody typing in the background. Okay, so the way we went about this was we used multiple methods. And so we used observations of the collaborative meetings, and also we did some key semi-structured interviews with key informants from within those trial collaboratives, and also others who work with the trainees and work with the collaborative. So ultimately they all culminated within up to a one-day stakeholder workshop that we held in London. So the interviews really were focusing on experiences of participating in the trials, involving the TRCs, looking at what some of the barriers and some of the facilitators may have been, and some ways that they've kind of overcome those barriers. And I'll talk to you about that in a little bit. So we sampled across the UK to include a range of specialities and also a range of different stakeholders. The data we collected, we analysed using a thematic analysis, and we did that through both a deductive or a theoretical approach, where we really wanted to find out some of the answers to our questions, so we kept those in mind. But we also allowed an inductive approach to take place, where we did allow some important aspects to emerge from the data. As you can see, overall, we interviewed 32 people from across 12 of the from across 12 of the collaboratives. So predominantly we did interview trainees because, you know, they're the key people. They're the ones we really wanted to know what perhaps barriers and facilitators they were experiencing. But we also engaged with the consultants, the research nurses and methodologists who had been involved in trainee trials as well. And within the trainees, we wanted to really get a sense of are the differences between perhaps people who just started their training journey and those who are perhaps coming later on towards their more consultancy roles. And as you can see there, we did have a nice spread from CT2, which is really the core training, right up to STH just before they had consultancy role. And so you'll see a lovely picture there of our team and some of the people who finally joined us as the stakeholder workshop, and maybe some familiar faces there. And what we did was we brought together findings from the interviews and observations. And what we did, we produced a guidance document which presented a range of strategies which could potentially enhance trainee engagement in research. And we presented that to the team, so there were 13 attendees there, and we asked them to rank what they thought would be the top 5 strategies for enhancing engagement with trials. So I'll just present some of the findings from our interviews and the observations. So ultimately, we wanted to understand, well, what motivates trainees to engage in trials? And what we found was their motivations tended to be split into 2 categories. So personal and altruistic motivations. So personal reasons included career progression. Some described them as purely selfish reasons, getting the line on the also some personal development, so some knowledge acquisition, helping to develop their own skills, and also, which was quite nice to share, was quite a lot of trainees said they engaged with trials because they genuinely enjoyed them. I think one person said that they got the research bug, and that really did push them forward with engaging with the trials. So some of the more altruistic motivations then, they wanted to help advance their field. They wanted to improve the care for patients, and they felt that engaging in trials was the way to do that. And what we found was they often started with these personal motivations, but as they progressed throughout their training and throughout more engagement with trials, they actually moved towards more altruistic motivations. And as I said, which group they fell into or what was their key driver really did depend on which stage in their training and their career they were at. So across the board then, the trainee research collaborators were viewed positively, and they felt that they were providing momentum in trial conduct and they were contributing to a shift in the culture of research. The interviewees spoke of the power of the organisations, and they recognised that this power lied with their ability to develop large multi-centre trials relatively quickly. So these collaboratives had the ability to access, well, not only access, but mobilise large numbers of trainees. And these trainees are well placed, so they're on the ground. They have access to patients. They're able to recruit them, and not only that, but they can also quite efficiently collect the report data, which those of you familiar with trials is quite key, really. But also on a more kind of trainee-centred platform is that they're able to provide the right infrastructure and environment for trainees to engage in trials and progress them through this knowledge and skills acquisition. They provide exposure to a variety of people with that knowledge and experience, And really what was key when we spoke to the interviewees was that these TRCs were able to provide mentorship and apprenticeship to the trainees. So there were a number of challenges, and I think one of the key challenge really was identified, I think, by all groups that we spoke to, was the time involved in actually getting involved in trials and being part of that. So, you know, these are people who are undergoing clinical training. They've got a number of competing demands. They've got a number of things going on, and ultimately, you know, to be able to engage in research, they felt that they just didn't have that time there. And as that quote says, it was often shifted to the bottom of the pile. A further challenge was that trainees felt that perhaps they weren't receiving appropriate recognition for their contribution. And this led to trainees being hesitant about taking part in research. Contributing to this was not having clear roles and responsibilities laid out, and they weren't really aware of what they would get recognised for. And again, this contributed to their hesitation. So also tied into that was authorship on papers. You can see from that quote there that, you know, they felt that perhaps they were putting in the time and the effort, that other people were getting recognition for their work. And this lack of transparency in the recognition wasn't just a challenge for the trainees themselves, but also the people who are working with the trainees and the trainee collaboratives. And so you can see that the quote at the bottom there, this was somebody who was quite upset with the fact that things weren't laid out ahead of plan, and it caused quite a lot of work later on. And I would say that there is some work going on around authorship, and that is progressing. So a further challenge then was around engaging and kind of pulling together the momentum and sustainability of the trainees and the trainee collaboratives. So trainee confidence was an issue. They could often find that what was described as breaking into the ranks of a trial collaborative or a trial team could be difficult. And this was particularly an issue if a TRC was established. And they found it could be intimidating. And, you know, this was more of an issue for people who were more junior, who were on the beginning of that journey. But also some people who may have moved from a different area could find that difficult. As I said, maintaining momentum was often difficult. So we heard about some TRCs that had started, were doing well, but unfortunately, as people moved on or people had less time to dedicate, unfortunately the collaborative kind of dropped off, and therefore the trials work dropped off. So there is consideration needed around how momentum can be maintained and how the TRCs can be more sustainable. So, you know, although there does seem to be a few challenges there, they're not insurmountable, and we did hear about how people had overcome these challenges, or how they suggest that these challenges could be overcome. And I think really what came through quite strongly was that the need for consultant support for the TRCs. So consultant surgeon involvement is really crucial to not only setting up the TRC, but maintaining that momentum I was just speaking about, and also bringing on board trials and taking them through. So their roles then can provide consistency for oversight and regulatory bodies. So, you know, trials work in an environment where trainees are often rotated between sites, and it's important really to have somebody placed there that can carry that consistency through. but also to help facilitate opportunities for research. As I was saying, you know, a key aspect of the collaboratives is to provide this mentorship. And one way of doing that is to have the consultants on board, and they're in a key position really to facilitate the involvement and help plan, bring them in and help plan and actually conduct the trials. So some practical ways of doing that were to seek out key known academic surgeons in the area, and also have consultants attend the trials collaborative meetings. So this was seen as quite helpful, and seen the fact that they were actually supporting the collaborative. So a further way of overcoming some of the challenges was to really have careful consideration of the study design. So there's quite a lot of pressure on trainees that they feel that they have to engage in large multi-centre trials, and this can be quite daunting. And it is important for trainees to be able to engage with accessible studies that are not only relevant to them, so tapping into this interest in the research that they're actually taking part in, but also a way to facilitate what people are calling these quick wins, which would help to motivate the trainees and also build the confidence. So the collaboratives then are in a key position then to facilitate networking and collaboration on audit type studies or observational studies, and really kind of facilitate that pathway into engaging more with trials. So it's important then, again, as I was saying, about tapping into what motivates trainees to engage in trials, is really to think about and be quite clear on what the trainees are getting out of this, and how that's recognised then. So it needs to be clear about what trainees are getting involved in. It's important to be realistic about what's expected, not just from the trainees, but from all parties involved from the start. There needs to be clarification around the roles and responsibilities and working pathways. So, for example, being quite clear about the time that's involved for trainees, and the level of commitment that they're actually going to be required during the trial period, and reporting as well. So again, tapping into authorship. So this could be done through drawing up terms of engagement, which are compiled and agreed by all parties involved, and having transparent authorship agreements. That also would help with that. And again, it promotes the confidence and this sense of ownership that trainees have over their work, and again could help with buy-in from the trainees, and also keep that momentum and sustainability in place. And I talked a little bit about how it's not just the trainees we need to engage, but it's also the people that work with them. And as I said, we did talk to some research nurses, and we talked to people from PALS units across the UK. And ultimately, what came out of that is that there needs to be a greater engagement and communication between the collaboratives and other collaborators. So including the trials units, and including the research networks and the research nurses as well. So thinking more about CTUs, what CTUs are really good at is providing methodological expertise and support, which complements the clinician's expertise and provides added value to trials, and really does help engage trainees in that research. So also, CTUs can benefit from access to the trials trainee collaboratives and the trainees conducting those trials. As I said right at the beginning, you know, the collaboratives are really good in their reach and their power, and how they can mobilise and access the trainees. And I also talked about, the benefits of having trainees involved. But what needs to happen is that these organisations need to work together. There needs to be more of a symbiotic relationship, and there needs to be a learning process in which the relationship and how they're going to work together can need to be cultivated and works both ways. And so some of the ways that CTUs have engaged quite well in this is by having key contact people within the CTUs. The people from the CTUs attend trials collaborative meetings and vice versa. And ultimately, I think what people were saying is it's bringing together the pieces of the puzzle. So again, that's a real strength in those organisations working together. And also a way of overcoming some of the challenges we talked about is really thinking about providing opportunities for pathways and activities for trainees to generate the study ideas and also to complete trials methodology training. So there is a need, I think, which most of the interviewees brought up and agreed with, is that there is a need to move away from the requirement for publication and to be able to critically appraise a paper, which is what the current requirements in most specialities to actually get their completion of clinical training certificate. So there does need to be a greater recognition of actual research activity, and that trainees need to learn or need to be able to learn in a more supportive environment. And again, to do this well, there really needs to be opportunities for trainees to learn and build their competency and build on their confidence. And again, this needs to be not only created but maintained. And what people found useful was that having access to methodology courses, so whether this is just basic trials methodology or recruitment to trials, so there are a few of those ongoing in the UK, and they were thought of, they were talked about in that they were really key to improving skills and recruitment to trials. But also it's important for organisations to create opportunities for on-the-job training. So this was important as well. So not just learning through direct study, but also on the job. And one way to do this was by engaging with co-chief investigator or co-principal investigator models. And I believe the NIHR have recently started a programme which tapped into this. But ultimately, they really do need an environment to be able to generate and develop study ideas and take that forward and actually see them through during the trials. And so they were the findings that we presented to the stakeholder group. And as I said, we did give them a guidance document which presented quite a number of different strategies, and we asked them to come up with their top 5 from that. And as you will see, these are the top 5 strategies which tapped into, as I've been talking about, overcoming the challenges. So I think number 1 really was seeking consultant champions to support the collaborative. Second was to have a flagship study with quick wins that would promote the collaborative. Third was to have more transparency, so talking about having clear guidelines around what's involved, timings, having transparent authorship policies in place. Then, as I've just been talking about, is really creating and maintaining opportunities, pathways and activities for trainees to generate study ideas and have access to and complete methodology training, and tapping into the fact that more people need to start working together or build on existing relationships is a better engagement and communication with trials units and university methodologists. And what I didn't have space to fit in there is really the importance of engaging and having those open lines of communications with the research networks and the research nurses. So in conclusion, surgical trainees are motivated to engage with trials, and there's a variety of reasons why that is. And trials research collaboratives can really improve surgical trainee engagement and training in trials, and also conduct of trials. There are challenges, but they're not insurmountable. They can be overcome, and I've talked about some of those. And finally, the 5 key strategies that were identified through the stakeholder workshop can really push forward trainee engagement and enhance this engagement going forward. So if there are any questions out there, so please do type them in, and you should now see some instructions on how you can do that. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Claire. That's really so interesting, and I think there are some people in the audience who maybe would be keen to take forward some of these ideas in their own settings. As Claire said, it would be really great to have questions from you. You're very welcome to speak if you want to unclick your microphone in order to do that. I think you can now do that yourself, or put a question in the chat box. And I can read that out for Claire and for everyone else. But I would quite like to start off, because for qualitative researchers, it's really important to think about context and setting. And we all know that historically there have been some gaps in the surgical trial literature and some challenges of carrying out trials in the context of surgery. How do you think, Claire, this might pan out if you were working in another setting with another specialty, and have you any plans to do that?
If I just address the if it can pan out into other specialities, I mean, I think some of the issues that did come up through the study are quite common, particularly time and the different pressures. I think that happens in all specialities. And also a lot of the challenges, like I suppose not so much with consultants, because in some areas there is a lot more consultant input than there is in surgery. But in terms of the other challenges and strategies, I do think they are transferable across the different specialities, and we have had some conversations with people, particularly in primary care practice, and they do recognise that these are issues that are more widespread than in surgery. And what we're currently doing, and we have actually had an extension to our grant to do some work around using digital storytelling practices to actually build on the strategies that we've got and take them forward, and actually use the stories that we create to consult with people in other specialities to see if the strategies that we've developed from this study are actually applicable to them. And hopefully we will be taking the work forward into other specialities.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, when you were talking, one of the things that struck me is that the field that I've done most of my qualitative research in, which is neonatal intensive care, historically it's a bit of a different field from surgery. Most of the evidence that has come out of clinical trials in neonatology has been picked up very enthusiastically, and the neonatologists are very keen users of clinical trials. And I suspect that means that a lot of people who are going into training to become neonatologists may be enthusiastic about trials themselves, and therefore you maybe get very enthusiastic consultants who would be very keen to sort of use methods to bring on their colleagues. So I can imagine another variant of this sort of model in a different setting. We've got a question in from Fiona, so I'd like to put that to you. She asks, do you think there are any challenges associated with the learning curve in surgical techniques, and whether this was something that the trainees may be affected by more than experienced surgeons?
That's a really good question. I mean, I can't say that talking about the learning curve did come up in interviews, but I mean that there was the issue around the competing priorities, and how research kind of can impact on their clinical training time. Sorry, just remind me, so the learning curve and how that can...
You can see the question yourself in the chat box, if that helps.
Okay.
But
I can't see the chat box.
Oh, you can't. Okay. So
No.
Fiona's asking if there are any challenges associated with the learning curve, presumably that the trainees are at a different point on the learning curve than the experienced surgeons.
Yes, so as I said...
But she's specifically talking about learning curve in surgical techniques, not learning curve in surgical trial techniques.
Well, as that didn't come up, I wouldn't like to really reflect on that, but that is something that we could be really interested in actually to consider when, as I say, when we're taking the study forward into the impact research and actually seeing if that does have an impact. But what I do know is that, you know, trainees who were more, you know, earlier in their career were again more concerned with getting those clinical skills in, and you know, perhaps I suppose if they're earlier in the learning curve, then they were the ones that had less time and less focus, well, less facility then to focus on research. So whereas the ones who were more established, I suppose it would be on the higher end of the learning curve, were more flexible around the time and focus that they could put into research.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that answers the question, but if it doesn't, I'm happy to discuss later. And as I said, we will take it forward.
Fiona may come back and tell us about it if it doesn't.
Yeah.
You mentioned digital stories a little while ago, and that might be something that not everybody's familiar with. Would you like to sort of revisit that and tell us a bit more about them and how you might use them?
Yes, well, what we do is quite a new technique that myself and other colleagues have developed, in that we take existing qualitative data, i.e. the transcripts and the observation notes, and what we try and do is summarize those and take out key points and work with a group of multidisciplinary people within a workshop to pull out what the kind of pertinent points are, and to map a journey, i.e. tell a story around perhaps what a challenge is or how to overcome that challenge. And what we do is we use different media techniques, so whether it's audio recording or it's actually filming someone, but it's using digital techniques to take quite a large body of qualitative research and break it down into perhaps a 5-minute video or a 5-minute audio, which really does get, you know, key points of that story across to people in a different version to what a paper or a summary or something written is doing.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. We've got a treat of a question from Katie, who asks about something that's really important in this setting. She says, how do trainees deal with the fact that some consultant surgeons might be fixed on some treatment and not really willing to randomise their patients into trials, while the trainee would want to do the research? How can this conflict be resolved?
Okay, that was something that come up, and it is a difficulty, and I can't say that we really nailed down the kind of the answer to that one. But I think some of the techniques that trainees kind of did was to say, well, we're involved in this established trial. I've been doing it in a previous setting. Some people use kind of evidence in terms of summaries for trainees. Summaries for consultants to argue a case. And I would say that was an issue and wasn't necessarily overcome, but I think working forward, as I said, trainee collaboratives are kind of shifting the culture and the views around surgical research, and hopefully that will be resolved over time.
Yeah. So Michael asks a question which I think is sort of related, because it's about access to research opportunities, and obviously your research opportunities are partly shaped by the interests of the influential people around you. He says trainees working in academic or tertiary centres often have academic consultants who can mentor and guide research. Since location of training is not completely controllable, for those working in secondary centres who may not have the same opportunities, in the context of collaborative research, this second group may not be able to take on a greater role. Has this been raised in your research? And if you want to comment on it, that would be great as well.
I think, as I said, that there is variability in how much people are engaged, not so much the trainees, but the people around them in research. But the opportunities are out there. And I think what came through the research was that these opportunities need to be more flexible, and perhaps take on a more kind of online role where the people, so consultants and other trainees who are engaged, can perhaps provide a supportive role to someone who's, I'm not quite sure what you mean by a secondary unit or secondary tier, but I think what you may be getting at is that some people have easier access to this training than others do. And I think that ties into our strategy of providing more opportunities. I think there needs to be thinking around how those opportunities can be created, and it's not just, you know, having attendance at courses and things like that. It is thinking in broader terms.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Claire, but I was at the workshop that Claire mentioned, and I seem to remember that within that workshop, people were talking about different levels of support in their units for time for research, and some people were talking about quite elaborate supportive processes, and other people were almost jealous that they, you know, wishing that they could have access to that same degree of support. So there was quite a bit of variety just within the clinicians who were there in that small workshop.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what as you say, within that workshop, I think sometimes there's a view that there isn't another way, and we are restricted by by the environment we're in. But I think by seeing what other people are doing and how they've achieved it, which hopefully this study contributes to, hopefully that they can see that there are other ways of doing things, and perhaps some of these strategies we've talked about can help contribute to that.
Yeah. Can we shift to thinking about some of the sort of methodological aspects of your work? You've got a lot of different strands, a lot of different methods going on. What sort of challenges did you face of sort of pulling all of those things together?
I mean, yes, I won't lie, it was difficult. Although they are kind of all qualitative, and they do take on, you know, certain aspects of how to gather data. I think ultimately it was how to pull together the observation work, the interview work, and we did sit down and have a conversation about how we were to do this. I think no two studies are the same, so we did have previous work to draw on, but aspects of this study were different. And I think what we did try and do is really have an integration of the methods, in that we moved back and forth the data that we were gathering. So we did some observation work and we reflected on that in terms of, okay, what questions do we need to ask in the interviews? Because these were actually conducted in parallel. And then vice versa, we were looking at interviews and thinking, right, when we go to observe these meetings, we'll see if these things are happening. So we'll see it, you know, we'll see if consultants are present at the meeting and what influence they have in that meeting, and how kind of the dynamics of the group work. And then drawing together to report as I said, we were drawing on both strands in terms of, okay, people have said this, is there any evidence in what we actually observed? That if there is, therefore that supports our argument. And then with the stakeholder meeting, it was really interesting to bring all that kind of qualitative data together and perhaps put a more quantitative spin on it, in that we were asking people to actually rank strategies, and then we pulled together what each group ranked, and kind of did a counting exercise then to see which the top 5 were. But I think the main thing to keep in mind if you are doing multiple methods is, how do they link together, and how can you use one to inform the other, and try not to, exclude one type of data. Always keep in mind how they can influence each other, or how they can support or even refute each other as well. It's always quite interesting to see well, they said that, but that's not actually what happened. And then bringing that together then to come up with 5 key strategies really has been a helpful way to conduct the study.
Yeah, thank you. I think that really points to the complexity of a piece of work like this, really.
Yeah.
I think we've covered all of our questions. Is there anything you wanted to add, Claire?
No, just a few of the questions I think could do with some deeper exploration, and I'm not sure if you record the questions, because as I said, I can't see them, but it would be interesting if I could see the questions and perhaps get in touch with the people who've posed them, and perhaps have further conversations around that. Okay,
well, Rionfa might be able to facilitate that for us, hopefully.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, Claire, for quite a different webinar for us. Very interesting. Okay. When you're leaving the session, please would you consider leaving your feedback. If you can see the link at the bottom of the slide that's on the page there, that will be really helpful. We do go through the feedback, and that also includes an option for volunteering to give a webinar if you're ever interested. It's a really nice thing to do. Your webinar goes onto our webpage and stays there as a recording. So you can also use it to publicise information about your study. And Rionfa's put a little link for us in the chat if anybody wants to click on it that way. That's an easy way to find it. Our next webinar is another nice treat. It's on the 29th of April, and the speaker is Sean Treweek, and Sean's given us one of these sessions before. It was really well attended, lots of questions, really interesting, and he'll be talking about whether we're collecting too much data. So that's a topic that is relevant to lots of people. So do come along, do give us your feedback. Those feedbacks get reported annually in our annual report, so they are really important and valuable to us. And thank you very much for your attendance. It's very heartening how many people do come along to these sessions. Thank you, everybody, and thank you in particular to Claire. Bye.